In the summers, Anchorage, Alaska sits under a sky that barely darkens. But for more than a decade, that endless daylight hid something. Women, many of them dancers and sex workers, were disappearing from the city's streets. Some were reported missing. Some were barely reported at all. And out in the wilderness north of Anchorage, hunters and hikers occasionally stumbled onto human remains in shallow, remote graves. For years, no one connected the pieces. Robert Hansen had built a quiet, respectable life. Born February 15, 1939, in Esterville, Iowa, he moved to Alaska in 1967 and established a bakery in Anchorage. To his neighbors and customers, he was an unremarkable local businessman, a family man, a baker, a hunter who flew his own Piper Super Cub plane into the backcountry. That ordinary reputation was, for a long time, his best cover. Because behind it, Hansen had developed a horrifying method. Investigators would later establish that many of his victims were hunted with a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle and hunting knives. He flew victims into the remote Alaskan wilderness aboard his Piper Super Cub. In the vastness of that country, far from any road or witness, the women he abducted had almost no chance. The isolation that draws people to Alaska was, in his hands, turned into a weapon. The case that finally cracked it open began on June 13, 1983. That day, Hansen pulled up to 17-year-old Cindy Paulson in his car and propositioned her. What followed was a kidnapping and rape, but Cindy Paulson did something that changed everything. She got away. She survived, and she went to authorities with a detailed account of the man who had taken her. Her report gave investigators a direction. It pointed them toward a local baker, a man with a private plane, hunting weapons, and access to the very wilderness where remains had been turning up. For the Alaska State Troopers, the pattern that had eluded them for years began to take shape. The scattered disappearances, the bodies in the backcountry, and now a living witness all converged on a single suspect. On October 27, 1983, Robert Hansen was arrested. What emerged from the investigation was staggering in scale. Hansen confessed to killing 16 women over a 12-year span, most of them dancers and prostitutes, women whose vulnerability and transient lives had, tragically, made their disappearances easier to overlook. He described a practice of flying his victims out to the wilderness, where he hunted them. In one of the most chilling chapters of the investigation, Hansen flew with investigators over an area north of Anchorage and pointed out where 17 of his victims were buried. He guided them across the same terrain he had once used to conceal his crimes, marking the ground where the missing had been left. Rather than face 17 separate trials, prosecutors reached a resolution. On February 18, 1984, Hansen was convicted. He was convicted of 4 murders in a deal that spared him having to go to trial 17 times. He entered his plea in Anchorage Superior Court on February 27, 1984. Then, on February 28, 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years, plus life in prison, with no parole. There would be no release. The baker who had hidden in plain sight would die behind bars, which he did in 2014. But a conviction is not the same as closure for the families of the missing. The work of recovering and identifying his victims continued long after the courtroom fell silent. In 1984, Alaska State Troopers returned to the areas Hansen had pointed out and discovered the remains of 8 women. In total, 12 bodies have been found, and 11 have been identified. That number carries its own quiet weight. Victims counted, but not all of them named. Families still waiting. Decades later, science reached back into the case. In 2021, a victim who had been known only as Horseshoe Harriet was finally identified through genetic genealogy. Her name was Robin Pelkey. She was 19 years old. For 37 years, she had been a placeholder, a case file nickname. Genetic genealogy, the same technology reshaping cold cases across the country, restored to her the one thing the wilderness had taken along with her life: her identity. The story of Robert Hansen is often told for its shocking mechanics: the plane, the rifle, the hunts in the Alaskan backcountry. But the deeper truth of this case lies elsewhere. For years, Hansen was able to continue because his victims were people society had been trained to overlook. Sex workers and dancers who went missing did not always trigger the alarm that other disappearances might have. His ordinary respectability shielded him, and their marginalization exposed them. It took a 17-year-old girl who escaped and refused to stay silent to break that pattern. Cindy Paulson's survival and her willingness to come forward were the turning point of the entire investigation. Without her, the pattern might have gone unrecognized for still longer. Her courage is a reminder that testimony matters, that the account of a single survivor can bring down a predator who believed the wilderness would keep his secrets forever. And the ongoing effort to name the unnamed, from the 8 women recovered in 1984 to Robin Pelkey identified in 2021, speaks to a promise investigators still work to keep. Every victim was a person, with a name and a family, deserving to be found and remembered. In the endless daylight of an Alaskan summer, they were made to vanish. The work of the years since has been to bring them, one by one, back into the light.